Vanessa has 56 years of experience as a Black woman in this culture. She has 30 years of anti-racist work and feminist work, a decade of studying interpersonal neurobiology, and 2 decades of shepherding the programs that support domestic violence and sexual assault survivors in Oregon. Bonnie, who has done some webinars with us before, I'm sure some of you have been here, has 77 years of relative blindness to the effects of racism. I can relate to that as well. Not 77 years of that. I'm a bit younger. 30 years of trauma work 17 years of closely studying how to apply interpersonal neurobiology to counseling in daily life, 3 books about the application of relational neuroscience. The most recent is called The Heart of Trauma, and 3 months of immersion in racism and anti-racism studies. So today, Bonnie and Vanessa are going to have some informal conversation, and we're beginning with history, the history of racism. We are here for 2 hours. We will end by 2 hours, but if we feel like the conversations come to a natural close before that, we'll go ahead and end a little bit early. Let's chat about questions, how we're going to handle that. It looks like right now we have about 192 participants here. That's a lot, and that can end up being a lot of questions. So everybody knows we have closed the chat feature for this webinar, primarily because Vanessa and Bonnie have explained to me that it's really important to them that we're able to really slow down and embody this conversation. And I feel honored to get to be part of that. And the chat feature, I think, can take us out of our body. So if you have questions, we want you to ask them, please. So if you will notice at the very bottom of your screen, there's a little place that says Q&A. That's your spot, okay? Those questions will go to Jo. So I'm going to introduce Jo first. Jo is Bonnie's partner, and she is here today to manage the questions. If there's a lot of them coming in, we probably won't have time for all of them, so she can decide which ones to give to Bonnie and Vanessa. So at certain times in the conversation, Vanessa and Bonnie will say, we have time for a couple questions, and Jo will likely pop back on the screen, unmute herself, and be back on the screen, and she'll give the top few questions that you've given to us. So what I will also tell you is that as we are recording this, I had a moment of, oh, did we record? Thank you, Tanner. We're recording. We're also recording the text from those questions so that we and Vanessa and Bonnie can all look at those questions after the call and decide if we need to address some things in our future webinars, if there need to be additional conversations. So we care about your questions. We just may not be able to get to all of them today, okay? Tanner, who you also see on the screen, he and I are basically officially hosting this. Natural Lifemanship's hosting this, but we're trying to manage the technology on the back just a little bit. So your questions are also coming to us, just so you know who all's seeing your questions, and any question is okay, all right? They will be seen by me and by Tanner, by Jo, by Vanessa, by Bonnie. That's who will see those questions. We may not all see them during the call, but after the call, we will have access to all of them, okay? And we all agree, all 5 of us. I believe Laura McFarland just popped in here as well. Hi, Laura. Laura is also one of the co-hosts for Natural Lifemanship, so that we're here to help with, we're going to be gone and we're going to be learners in just a minute. Bonnie, is there anything else I need to say as far as sort of the technology? Vanessa, is there anything I'm missing before we pop out of here?
No.
No. Okay. Thank you, both of you, for being here. We're honored to get to host this, and I'm honored to get to sit in this space and embody this conversation. And we are gone, and you two take it away.
Thank you. Appreciate you very much. Good morning, Bonnie.
Good morning, Vanessa.
It's wonderful to see you and be here with you and to be here with everyone in this interesting times that we find ourselves in. And I wanted to start with just a check-in. You know, how are you doing since I last chatted with you? We talked before we did our check-in this morning. We had talked like a week or so ago, and things have already changed as we knew that they would. So how are you doing?
Well, it is such interesting times. It just feels like everything is so full all the time and pulling our attention. And so today I'm feeling a little calmer than I have some days, and I'm grateful for that. I don't feel quite as stirred up. I know I'm not sleeping well. I think so many people aren't sleeping well. You know, there's so much, again, so much we have to somehow manage in these little fragile human bodies and minds and hearts and all of that. I do notice that I feel a lot of joy in getting to be here with you, and something I shared with you earlier, if I was doing this alone, it would feel like the height of arrogance. It feels wonderful that we get to do this together. You are such a dear person to me. I also am aware that I have kind of like an ache behind my heart that is a place where so many people, so many Black people who have lost their lives lives. And right now that space seems to be filled mostly with Jacob Blake, and aching for that whole experience and all that it means. So that's me. How are you today?
Wow. Yeah, I agree. Like, I feel like I think I mentioned that I woke this morning and kind of rushing to go for a walk and turned on the news and heard that, you know, another African-American man was killed. And I didn't even hear where, right? I was going to circle back and, you know, my husband, I mentioned it to him on my walk. And so it's just such a, I guess I feel like I'm treading water. Like, that's the way I would describe this feeling of, you know, you're treading water and you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm strong and I'm treading water and it's really cool. And then a wave comes and you go under and you have to get back up. And so there is that feeling of just, ooh, bracing for the next wave. But then as I was on my walk, I saw that one of my neighbors, I live in Vancouver, Washington right now, and one of my neighbors had put this gigantic sign in their yard that said, "End racism now," on one side, and on the other side, it was there was a political statement of who to vote for. And my husband and I just laughed and felt great joy. So there's just this moment of, you know, both and, I think, is how I would describe what I'm feeling. And yeah. But I also, can you, Bonnie, talk a little bit about why we decided to do this? Because I think it would be good for folks to hear, because this is a little bit different than, I do anti-racism training all the time in different ways. And this is a really unique experience for me. And I thought it would be cool for folks to hear how this came about and why we're doing 3 webinars about race with just us 2 chatting.
Yeah. Yes, I would be glad to, because it almost felt like it happened to us rather than something that calculated, because we were talking, just chatting with each other and both saying, like, you know, now what do we do, and all of a sudden it just sort of came over us. I mean, it really did feel like it got given to us somehow, Vanessa.
At the same time.
The same moment.
At the same moment, yeah.
And for me, what's so important is that I think, you know, as a white woman, I have permission somehow to be upset about things and then forget about them, and be upset about them and then forget about them, which of course you don't have that permission. Mm-hmm. But I am so concerned about what do we do to keep this alive and what kind of internal changes to accompany the external changes are necessary in order that we actually stick with this and have something permanent happen here. And I do think it takes both internal as well as external changes. And so I know that over these 3 that we'll be, expanding into that. But that's what draws me here is that. And also, I really know that affinity trainings with all white people and all Black people are important, but I also think these conversations are extremely important. And we care so much about each other that maybe we could pull it off and it'd be okay. So.
Right, and I was just struck by how tough the conversations have been with other folks, right? And there was, but when we were talking, I was able to be really vulnerable and really frank. And I realized that the conversation needed to happen so that folks could experience the profound possibility that exists with trust, right? That trust gives us this opportunity to be really vulnerable and really real. And that we're trying to have these conversations before the trust is there, right? We've got the house is on fire and we're trying to put it out, but we don't know each other and we don't have a plan. And it felt like there was something really profound in the trust and us being able to just really cry together and be scared together, be wrong together, like know how to talk about it, right? That I thought would be a nice thing to share. That's why I wanted to do it.
Yeah. So it feels really good to be doing it. This minute feels good.
Yeah. So we also wanted to make sure to just invite folks to, I know that when we did the introduction, we talked about us wanting to be an embodied conversation, but just remind people to take lots of good breaths, to put your feet on the floor, to close your eyes and listen if you need to. But to really find a way to be with the conversation in your own way and to let your questions rise. If you have a pen and paper handy, jot down your questions as they arise so that you can make sure to be able to get them answered when the time is right. Just some ways to prepare to be in this space. Do you have anything to offer to that, Bonnie?
Well, just certainly the importance of us being able to these wonderful embodied brains that we live in give us kind of 2 ways to listen. One through a more left hemisphere lens where we just tend to hear the facts. They don't stick very well. They kind of fall off of us and they don't really help to create change. So what Vanessa is saying is we breathe and ground our feet and really get into our bodies. We have the opportunity for this other hemisphere of the brain, the right hemisphere, to actually begin to experience what it is we're talking about. And it's from that kind of experience that change becomes possible. Because if we don't do that, it just falls away very, very quickly as our left hemisphere goes off on the next topic. And so I think that, again, so many of us white folks have had the privilege, the permission to maybe know some facts and then leave it. And so I'm wanting to commit myself to not doing that. And we want to invite all of you as much as possible to let this kind of right hemisphere capacity of deep feeling from the heart be available as we're talking. So that seems really important. And then I think we wanted to offer one other little piece from relational neuroscience that I think when you and I were talking, Vanessa, you said after I talked about this, you said, well, that's hopeful. That gives us some hope that it's possible to do what we yearn for. So as you know, back in the olden days of the beginnings of this field of psychology, the main ways that it was talked about made us sound like kind of brutish people whose insides were at war with each other all the time. And one of the real gifts of relational neuroscience that's just developed in the last couple of decades really strongly is to let us know that that really isn't who we are as human beings. If you take a newborn child and they get a good 3 years of nurturance and care under their belt, we naturally, as human beings, develop into empathically connected, deeply concerned about other people, human beings. That's who we're intended to be. We're intended to be supportive of each other, to be able to listen to and be with each other, to support the well-being of others. And so, and not just of each other, but also of all the beings on the earth and the earth itself, that we feel a sense of relatedness, of connectedness that allows us to move together in ways that are healing for everybody and provide for sustenance for this beautiful planet on which we live. So the big question to me is, how did we get to this place where that's a rarity, where that's so hard to be with? Because it is our innate nature. That is who we are meant to be by our very biological design. And how did we get away from that?
Right.
That's the question I think that's on the table for all three of these webinars. How did we get there? How do we find our way back?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when I mentioned how hopeful that was to me, it was because the story, the narrative that we are living in, like, because I believe, part of my culture and my traditions is that we live our stories, right? One of my grandmother's favorite things to say to me in the morning when I woke up was, "What did you dream?" Right? She wanted to know what the story was that I was carrying in my body. And it's such a different story that you described than the story we're hearing all the time, which is we're all divided. There's two different worlds. I just loved what that new framework that you gave, the neurobiology framework.
Well, it's what's been given to us over the last while, and I'm so grateful for it because it's a huge change in how we understand what it is to be human. Joe, I don't know if there are any questions yet that you would want to bring in here before we move into the next part. Well, you have to unmute yourself or we can't hear you.
There she goes.
There you are now.
Hi, Joe.
Hi there. So one question that came in, maybe you've sort of addressed it, but perhaps you can say a couple more words about is, what do you mean by embody? You spoke some of that, but maybe another couple of sentences to illuminate that.
You want to say something about it, Vanessa?
Well, when I say embody, it means to do what I call deep listening to my body, right? It's I might be thinking all kinds of things about what's happening, but what my body, I always tell my daughters, you can't outrun your body. You can't think more quickly than your body thinks. And so it's paying attention to what your body is carrying, right? Is your heart racing? Do you have tension in your jaw? How is your belly? How do your muscles feel? Are they grounded, or do you have tension and tightness? And so when we're having these conversations about race and racism and anti-racism, and even later as we talk about allyship and all of the different things that we hope to bring, how is your body receiving that? Because that is a more foundational way of knowing what you're learning. So it's listening with your whole self. That's my perspective on that. How about you, Bonnie?
I would say exactly that, and especially all from here all the way down through our heart and into our belly and all the way down and then into the muscles of the legs is really the strongest communication that we have about what's happening for us right in this moment. And we've learned to tune it out because we carry so much trauma in our systems that to listen to that conversation is really painful. And so we have a tendency to kind of cut off that capacity for safety's sake, adaptively, we have cut off that capacity, and we're inviting us as best we can to move toward that capacity again and redevelop it, because just like Vanessa said, it's the true story.
Yeah.
And how we carry our history in our bodies is there. So,
and the only thing I would add is I think that sometimes we're not having embodied conversations about race. We're talking from a place that isn't necessarily the full truth of how we're feeling, right? I think sometimes we're not able to even express how terrified we are about this break we've had with one another based on how we look, and how profoundly the loss that we experience with this break of not being able to fully be in community with one another. Like, that's not something we know in our heads, but we feel that in our bodies. The lack of community that we crave to be with one another, and the fullness that we wish we could have. Yeah.
One of our teachers in interpersonal neurobiology is Steve Porges, and the sentence he says that just resonates and rings inside of me all the time is that connection is a biological imperative. And when we don't have rich, warm connections, we're actually in violation of our whole biology.
Yeah.
Feel it in our bodies. We really carry that sense of disruption in the body primarily. And then it becomes behaviors, but it's first in here.
First here. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So the second question, I mean, there are a couple of questions in this ballpark, and I think it links to what you both have just said, is about trying to have the conversation between people of different colors, and how to, do you have any suggestions or comments about how to try and cultivate? Vanessa, you spoke about the sense of safety that allowed for the conversation between you and Ani, but you all have a relationship that goes back 10 years.
Yes.
When people are trying to have this conversation with people they don't know that well and don't already have an established trust with, do you have any comments about how might they go about it, and how might we cultivate the permission to make mistakes?
I do. And Bonnie, I bet you do too, but I'll just speak from, just from that real place of being in the grocery store. So this just came up for me. As you can imagine, I, as a Black woman in Vancouver, Washington, have had many of my conversations about race are happening in the Fred Meyers up the street. And they're happening with people that don't know me well, that are just doing what we're all doing, craving that connection, but don't know how. And so what I can say about that is that there is a way to just be honest with people that I personally have found really nourishing. People saying, I have a question, or I don't know how to say this. I don't know how to talk about this, but is it okay if I talk about it with you? But it's about race. I think that permission is a really important component for me. If someone asks permission, I can say not right now, or I can say not at all, or I can answer. And I think that it's frustrating when someone doesn't ask permission to have those deep conversations. So I would say that's one piece. And the other piece is just being honest about how scary this is for us. And I've come to appreciate that. At first, it was really, I have to be honest, it was really strange to have people just kind of coming up to me and saying, oh, can I talk to you about this? Or I got this email and I don't know what to do with it. At first, it was just like, oh, kind of off-putting. But now I've come to kind of appreciate some of those conversations. And I definitely think permission is a big piece of that, asking permission.
Yeah, I really think every white person needs to just hear what you said about permission, about you freedom to say yes or no, and
Yes.
comfortable for you and you getting to take the lead. And I think that this whole experience for me has just reinforced the absolute need for humility on my part in all of these conversations, of knowing I don't know, I haven't been informed, I don't know what might hurt you or not hurt you. I know the other day I just asked you what has hurt you most as a Black woman in this culture, and you seemed almost startled that I asked, like,
Yeah.
did I?
Yeah. Because we don't talk about the pain of race with white people, right? Like it's deeply personal. The consequences of racism are deeply personal for us. They're not theoretical, or it's not an ideology. It's an experience that we are having and that our ancestors have had for generations. And the pain of that, I carry my own pain, but my grandmother's pain and my grandfather's pain. And so it is such a personal thing. It's not often talked about. But I so appreciated the question as well. But I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to talk about this deep, really fundamental pain with Bonnie. Yeah.
But what you said about deep listening, I think is the important thing. I think that us white people can become defensive and think I have to prove to you that I'm not a racist and all of that. And I think that's really super counterproductive. I want to just listen. I want to learn. I want to know. I want to be close in as you are comfortable having, as comfortable as, where at whatever level you're comfortable with that.
But I will say that the acts of anti-racism are very nourishing, seeing Black Lives Matter signs and knowing that folks are curious and wanting the sincerity. The sincerity, we feel it. Like that's that embodied experience. I can feel the difference between curiosity and a sincere desire to connect with me as a human, to learn how my experience is different than their own. And that happens across race. And there's a difference between that and just the act of curiosity.
Yeah. Thank you, Jo.
Bye, Jo. Okay, Bonnie, so you were going to talk about neurobiology, the neurobiology of it.
Well, I think we've done maybe enough to get started anyway,
Okay.
as far as neurobiology goes. And again, to just invite as much as possible, because I think I get to talk about the kind of title for today was Haunted by History. And until I read Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, had briefly considered the kind of trauma that white bodies were carrying from their experiences in Europe before they came here. And that unhealed, what I know as a trauma therapist, is unhealed trauma will invariably be visited on others. It's just what we do. We have to put it somewhere. If we don't heal it, the patterns of it come out at others. And so in what he was writing about, it prompted me to begin to look more at what that was like. Not that it makes any excuse for any kind of awful treatment of Black people and Indigenous people as well, for what we have done to our Indigenous people. But if it can provide some kind of deep understanding of what we carry now and how we might begin to approach changing that legacy so that what we pass on to the next generation and then to the next generation can finally begin to change. So as we're here together, then to sit, regardless of whether you are in a Black body as you're with us here today, or a white body, or an Indigenous body, or another person of color, whatever it might be, to begin to just sit with what it is that with some of those experiences. I had not understood, I don't think, fully. And this is what's amazing to me about this, Vanessa. Surely somewhere in my history classes, this got talked about in school. I mean, I was in school in the 50s and 60s, and honestly, I do not feel like any of this made a dent in me, and I'm not even sure how much of it was talked about, honestly. Now, I have my own trauma history, which also made it hard for me to attend and take things in school, especially when I was younger. And so there may be some of that, but I don't know how much of it was just, it got chunked away in my left hemisphere till I took a test, and then I forgot about it, and it made no impact on what it actually meant. So coming back to it now and trying to slow down and really sit with these experiences, for white on white people, in other words, what white people were experiencing together, white-bodied people were experiencing together for centuries in Europe, is torturous. It's torturous from many different angles. One of them is that there was a series of plagues, and so one's survival was simply threatened all of the time about whether you could make it through. When the plague would hit, often villages would lose half of their people, and there would be untold suffering. So that leaves a mark, the uncertainty of that and the illness of that. But beyond that, the part that pains me so profoundly as a, especially I think as somebody for whom trauma has been really important as kind of the core of my work, is to hear about and feel into the kinds of tortures that were applied within the hierarchy on people as a method of control. I mean, the kinds of things where bodies were dismembered, where parts were cut off, where there was public humiliation all of the time, basically living in a society filled with terror on a moment-to-moment, day-by-day basis, where there was no safety.
Yeah, and I remember, Bonnie, one of our I was going to just I was reminded about a conversation we had where you said that some of the villages would compete. Can you talk a little bit about to have some of those things come to their town? Do you remember that piece of it? Yeah.
I totally remember that piece of it, because at some point when we are subjected to trauma day in and day out, in order to survive, we develop adaptive ways of not feeling any longer. It takes us away from our humanity. And then once that process starts, we no longer actually feel the impact of what's happening, as long as it's not happening to us or somebody standing right next to us. And so over time, it became a practice that different villages would compete, and there was actually a market for who would host the next public execution. And these weren't quick executions. These were being drawn and quartered. These were kinds of things where people were tortured before they were hanged and things like that. And that it was considered sport at that point to be able to have that in your community. And what I shared with you, Vanessa, as I was picturing this kind of, it's like the county fair day kind of thing, only it's for the torture. To take that and then to situate it right next to pictures of people having picnics while Black people were lynched, it feels to me like it's an exact replication of what happened and what we were carrying in our bodies when we arrived here. And it just makes me beyond sad, all of it, the whole history from Europe all the way to that. And so as hard as it might be for us to sit with that right now, I think to begin to feel how that impact has moved forward and how it's still moving forward. It didn't stop,
right.
Lynching stopped.
No. And that's the challenge of our time, right? Is to hold it. Like, can we hold this haunted history enough to allow ourselves collectively as a people to heal?
Grieve,
grieve.
Yes.
To grieve it, right? Because if we can't notice that, embody that story that you just told, then we can't grieve it. right? If we're pushing it away and saying it's not relevant, right?
Yeah. Or hearing it just as facts, oh, these were the facts of our history, and that was a long time ago. In our bodies, it wasn't a long time ago. I mean, epigenetically and through historical kinds of trauma, these patterns get set in and they get passed down from generation to generation to generation. And then they show up in our white families, also with white on white violence still. And then structurally in our communities, so much of it has been framed around the difference in body color that has nothing to do with our humanity at all. And so it's become a system for containing this trauma that's never been dealt with. So it's being really important for me to sit with, my awareness that my people at that point were in Germany and in France, and were experiencing this kind of brutality, and then came over. I think I'm about fourth generation from those people here in the United States, but that their history goes back into this incredible inhumanity and deadening. I mean, we have to deaden ourselves. You cannot live in a society that's doing that and survive it if we don't deaden ourselves, if we don't split off the actual experience of it. And then we begin, one of the things that Resla Menachem says is that when you take history and when you take trauma and you decontextualize it, you get culture. So now we have a culture of the passing down of trauma. And because of the way that Black people came to our shores, they became a very natural target for it in a way that is just beyond. I have no words, Vanessa. I really don't.
Right. There are few words for the experience that our ancestors went through. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't. So in the midst of all of this, I had a dream one night, and I know how much you value dreams, and I'm not someone who remembers their dreams a lot generally, but since all of this started, like from the time the pandemic started on to all of the other things we've gone through, all of a sudden my dream life is extremely active and sometimes quite torturous. And in this dream, I was somehow both the captain of the ship with Black people in the holds, and also the Black people in the holds. Somehow the dream took me into both of these experiences, and the feeling of how utterly dead you would have to be to stand, as captain of a ship with knowledge of what was happening below decks and what had happened to get the people below decks to start with, but then what the suffering that was happening through the middle passage. And that dream has left an enormous mark on me, both of feeling the trauma of the captain that led him to even be able to be doing this, as well as what was happening for people, ripped out of their lives and brought here with tremendous suffering. So it's been, again, I just want to invite everybody who's here with us, if it feels possible in this moment, if it doesn't feel like it will be too much in this moment, to kind of feel into both of those places as well, and just to have a sense of the amount of trauma that was aboard that ship in everybody on it. Yeah.
Well, I wrote a short story once about the middle passage, and I was a young woman. I'm struggling with trying to understand everything, and my parents were civil rights activists, so I was immersed in conversations around race and equity all of my life, actually. And I wrote it from the perspective of the slave ship captain, for that very reason that you're talking about, the invitation you gave us to enter into it. And in my story, it wasn't trauma that he was experiencing, and this was just in my story, but it was, he just didn't see them as human.
Yes.
It's kind of like what you would do if you were fishing, kind of thing. It was the weirdest moment. I just never forgot it, and it came to me as you were talking, that the dissonance of being both, right?
Yes. Well, yes, and from that viewpoint of not seeing the Black people on his ship as human, that's what happens when we can no longer sustain a living connection with our own inner world because of the amount of trauma we have a tendency to shift into a more transactional left hemisphere mode. And at that point, nobody's a human being anymore.
Right. And we see some of that now, right? Yeah.
Human beings.
Yeah.
And so much of our culture now has that more left hemisphere transactional kind of thing. What's in this for me, and how do I get my success? Because there's no felt sense of connection in the left hemisphere. And so we're utterly alone. And we have to flee to the left sometimes because the trauma is too much to bear if we're in contact with the suffering that we carry more in our right hemisphere and in our bodies. So I think what you were sensing about the lack of humanity and what I'm saying about trauma really are the same.
They're the same, yeah.
The same, that it's the result of having to no longer stay in touch with our own humanity. How can we see others as human if we're not even in touch with our own humanity and our own suffering? We can't. Another small piece of history that I hadn't known about, well, if I knew, I don't remember. Slavery was here right on the heels of the first permanent settlement. In 1607, the first British settlement that lasted arrived, and in 1619, the first slaves arrived. But when they arrived, the situation was a little bit different than what it became, and this to me feels like an important piece for us to understand. The original alignment in the states where labor had to be in to do all the work on the plantations and to build the economy, there were poor white people and there were Black people. And at the beginning, they were allied together because of the hierarchical nature of it. And they were both poor and having to work really hard, were indentured, that kind of thing. And so there was an alignment. And what the white people were the plantation owners in the South realized, because there got to be revolts, there were rebellions, and that included both the Black and poor white people banding together to protest against the treatment that they were getting. So again, in this need to separate and keep your advantage, because you feel so utterly broken inside that the only thing you've got is to hold on to your advantage, is the way I understand it. To avoid having to deal with it, began to give the white people on the poor people on the plantation more privilege, so that they would ally with the white people. That was really the origin, from what I'm understanding. And again, blind 77-year-old white woman who's just get some idea of some of this, and I would love to be corrected if I'm saying anything that doesn't make sense to you or doesn't tally with what you know.
No, yeah.
And so that was really the origin of this whole idea even of race, because race is a made-up construct. It's not that we're different human beings. It's a made-up construct, and made up for financial reasons, so that the white people would become allied. The poor white people would be thought to be more like the white people who were in control, and would leave Black people permanently less.
Yes, absolutely.
So I didn't know that either. And of course, white on white violence continued in the New World as well, when people came here. And gradually it was shifted over so that it was much more aimed at Black people. But not when we first arrived. When we first arrived, of course, we brought our trauma with us, and people were put in stocks and had their tongues cut out and all kinds of horrible things, white on white violence in those early days, and the witchcraft and burning people at the stake.
Yes.
All of the kinds of things that were, again, like images of what had been going on in Europe. But the people who fled here thought they were leaving, and they just brought it with them. I mean, we all do. We just bring it with us, right? We bring it with us, and then it has to go somewhere. So I wanted to come to just before I leave this and we have questions, and then I want to hear so much from you, my dear, of course.
And that was very haunting, Bonnie.
I've been so touched by it. I'm just.
Yeah. I mean, we titled it haunted history, and it's just, these are, we can hear these, right? Or we can hear this.
We can really hear this. And again, putting ourselves on both sides of it, ourselves both in the shoes of the one who is causing the harm, and also putting ourselves in the shoes of the one receiving the harm, and knowing that all of that lives within us. Both sides of it, both the one who's being victimized and the one who is being the perpetrator, all of that history lives within us. So we're asking ourselves to do something really big when we begin to approach this as living in our bodies. Just as I'm talking here, I'm aware that my thigh muscles are tight. There's a place to run.
My shoulders are going up like that.
My belly is tight, and then the next thing that happens for me after that is I just would like to eat a gallon of ice cream.
I'm with you, sister. I think when you said that it's powerful history, I think that that's an indication of how transformative that history can also be, or the holding of that history, right? The power is there for a reason. It tells our bodies that there's medicine there. There's medicine in the weight of this. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And the fact that we carry it lets us be able to heal it. If we didn't have it, like you're saying, the power is in the way we carry it. And if we can begin to recognize it, imagine the energy of goodness that can be released as we heal it. After see how individual lives are transformed as they do trauma work over time.
Yes.
It's certainly true for this society. Imagine what it would be like to be able to consciously take this on. Resmaa Menakem says he thinks it's 9 generations that it will take, but any change we make this moment, anything we're willing to take on and begin to be with, is going to be handed down epigenetically, and then epigenetically, and then epigenetically, and also as we internalize one another. We're internalizing each other in a slightly different state.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about one last piece of history, Vanessa, before we do this, because I shared this with you the other day, and this was something you hadn't heard about a stolen election.
Yes.
So now we get up to the Civil War, and in the 10 years after the Civil War, Reconstruction actually begins to happen. Federal troops stay in the South so that there's enforcement, election, voting begins to happen. Black people begin to be able to take part in all different kinds of ways in society. And so things were looking pretty good for a period of time there, that there might be actual change. And then 10 years after this, we get to an election that changed everything, which I think, as you hear about this, speaks to the tenacity of the need to not actually change the system.
Mm-hmm.
So Tilden, I think, was from New York. I hope I get most of these facts right.
It's not about the facts.
I may lose the facts. I'm also a little old lady, and sometimes I hold the big picture pretty well, but I don't always get the facts right. But I believe Tilden, who was a Democrat, and the Democrats were actually the party that wanted to be in power in the South at the time. Things were not, the alignments of parties were very different back then. So he was apparently a really good talker and all of that, and thought that he would win the election. Whereas Hayes was like I'm a very interesting person, kind of like, Pablum or something. I've got to turn off this printer because it keeps cleaning.
Oh, okay. No problem.
So the pleasures of working from home, right?
Yes.
So as the election happened, the experience was that it looked almost for sure like Tilden would win. And there were 3 states in the South where the ballots had not yet been fully counted. So the people who were backing Tilden counted the ballots, and the people who were backing Hayes counted the ballots, and they counted them very differently. They got rid of things, all sorts of stuff. So then they sent their counts to Congress to certify the election, and in one, Hayes had won, and in the other, Tilden had won. So now here we are in the Capitol, and and we're looking at how do we resolve this kind of thing. So this went on for months and months. Inauguration didn't happen till March back then, so they had more time to argue about it. So they go back and forth, and eventually what happened is Tilden, who it was clear had actually won the election, agreed to not win the election under the following conditions. All federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. All protections for Black people would be done away with. And basically Reconstruction was ended. And because of the kinds of laws that were allowed to be instituted at that point, basically Black people were put back into slavery, mainly because if there was any kind of infraction and you went to jail, then you could be sold. And all of this happened in that way. And again, you feel the power of the system that is going to assert itself even at the cost of giving up being president. I mean, I was just astonished and heartbroken.
I was too. Yeah, I was so shocked to hear that. I mean, not shocked, like, oh my God, they couldn't do that, but oh my goodness, this tells us so much about the story of how we got here and how hard the system fights to maintain power and control.
Yes. Yes, how hard it fights to maintain power and control. And again, that whole kind of conversation and manipulation, again, is entirely a left hemisphere transactional thing. It has nothing to do with humanity. It has nothing to do with connection. It has nothing to do with anything except what you're saying, power and control, what abuse survivors often.
Right. And it's an illusion, right? It's an illusion of power and control.
Well, and the other thing, I read, I don't remember exactly where I read this, but what we know is that when I, as a human being, inflict a wound on you as a human being, even if I know nothing about it, there's a moral and even a biological violation of my humanity. So
absolutely.
Me doing that awful thing to you is also further cementing in and injuring me. We are not separate from each other.
No,
So
not at all.
get buried deeper and deeper and deeper with more and more wounding. And then that's what holds the whole system in place to the extent that this kind of thing can even happen.
Right.
The last thing I say to you, my dear friend, and to every Black person, I don't know how you didn't all just collapse and give up.
We're not made that way.
Not made that way. And it is, I know you'll probably talk about why that is, but after the more that I learned, Vanessa, the more that the fact that you and also our Indigenous people persist and provide such value and such clarity and such spiritual depth for our nation is an absolute miracle, but also a tribute to you.
Right, to the human spirit. I think the biggest, and I'll talk more about history in a bit, but I think the biggest consequence, the most painful consequence of the enslavement was the lack of humanity, right? The separation of our people from their humanity. And that's what we're talking about, right? Is just that stripping away.
Right.
But Bonnie,
and that's because the humanity in the people that were stripping away your humanity had been lost so long ago. Somewhere in here, we probably want to pause for questions too.
That's what I was going to say, is that I thought, but it's just before I asked Joe to come back on and give us some questions, it's that collective loss of humanity, right? It's the loss of humanity to all of us as our ancestors, because we inherited this, right? We were not present for this. This is an inheritance that we have as a nation. And part of our inheritance is the loss of collective humanity that our ancestors engaged in and was perpetuated against them. Yeah, that collective loss of humanity.
It's all, yeah, I mean, just even to pause there for a minute and, you know, feel into what that means.
Yeah. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Joe. Somebody needs to, she can't unmute herself.
Oh, Joe needs to be unmuted.
There. There I am.
Thank you. Probably Tanner. Thank you, Tanner, or Benita.
So there are a number of questions now. We probably don't have time for all of them, but let's start with, someone asked if you could explain the process of epigenetic transmission. They didn't ask it quite that way, but that's what how is it that we're carrying trauma from parents, grandparents, great-grandparents?
Do you want to tackle that one, Vanessa?
Bonnie, if you could start with that one. I mean, I know how I teach it when I'm teaching, but I need all my things. So
Right, that's what we were saying. Like, we're just
I don't
talking.
have all the stuff I need.
We don't have our PowerPoints. Well, one of the remarkable things about the human genome is it's not very big, and so most of our variations and the way we've developed has to do with which genes are turned on and off and what combination. So most of what we often think of as genetics is really epigenetics, which means that different pieces of our DNA gets turned on, and what turns it on is experience. So there are certain genes that's pieces of the gene that don't manifest at all unless trauma has happened. And then they can manifest in different kinds of ways. And so if I have an experience, then, and I'm now going to, you know, at some point get pregnant and have a baby, the epigenetic changes that have happened in my body are going to now pass over to the next generations. And it's complicated. It's the maternal grandmother is the most powerful piece of all of this, because whoever asked that question, your mother's eggs were in her when she was conceived by grandma. So she's picked up in her eggs the genetics of grandma's, but the complication probably doesn't need to be there. Well, we're at the tip of the iceberg of epigenetic discovery. But what we know is every time, whether we're looking at octopuses or we're looking at mice or whoever we're looking at, the more we study, the more we see that this epigenetic inheritance goes back through more generations than we thought before. I think with octopuses now, it's like we can trace it back 18 generations, and mice 8 or 10 or something like that. And I don't follow it closely enough to give you exact numbers. But what we're discovering is that pieces of our history are transmitted in this way and keep coming down through, you know, the next generation and the next generation. But what that also says is, if now I have a different experience of care from Vanessa, that's changing my epigenetic history in that caring relationship. So it's possible then for so much to change, and more with humans than with most animals or anything, because again, our genome is small, but our epigenetic potential is huge. So what would you?
Yeah, that's exactly, you know, the way I describe it is to say I was born not just of my mother, but of her mother and her mother and her mother before her, right? I was made in my great-great-grandmother's eggs, and all of the experiences that my great-great-grandmother had that changed and shaped who she was as she carried me in the eggs of her body are expressed in me in the 21st century. I'm an expression of her resilience and her pain because I'm made up of her body, because I lived in her eggs.
That's right.
So that's how I describe it.
You have a different experience. experiences, that next inheritance will be a little different for your grandchildren.
Yes, yes, my little ones. Yeah. Because we're born of the generations before us. I mean, I just love the knowledge that we have now of how our ancestors carried us in their body, in their eggs, and in their semen. That's how they carried the blueprints that make us. And so if there was famine, those eggs are affected by the famine. If there's trauma, those eggs are affected from the trauma, and that's passed through to the next generation. That's my understanding. I think it's really fascinating.
It is. So, and then we also carry the implicit history too, which is another whole strand of, I mean, there's depth. There's so much depth. We're not disconnected from each other here, and we're not disconnected from each other back through history.
Okay. So another question, there are several sort of related. Does the acknowledgement of the trauma that European whites experienced prior to coming to this country in any way let them off the hook for the acts that they perpetrated on Black people once they got here?
Yes, what I would say is it in no way lets anybody off the hook. However, it does seem helpful and profoundly important that I, sitting here in this body now, can say that I don't need to feel ashamed or guilty that this is what has come into my body. What I do know is that I am the only one who can take full responsibility for healing in this body, so that what gets passed forward is different, becomes changed. I'm 100% responsible for what's here. And I say this because when I know, in working with so many trauma survivors, when we get swallowed up in guilt and shame, healing stops. We can't move toward any kind of development of change in our system when that's what's swallowing us up. So I know this is a really fine line to walk, but I'm saying what I'm saying because I'm so eager for us to find ways, us white people to find ways to begin to be with this without getting so lost in guilt and shame that we wind up in the same place where we started. So that's why I say it that way.
Yeah, and just from my perspective, I think that I'm so grateful for the question, because there is a tenderness and a fine line that we walk here. And the truth always requires a tenderness and a fine line. There's no easy story here. There's no easy, simple answer. This is a complicated nightmare that we find ourselves waking from. And I think that there's absolute accountability, but there can be accountability without and honoring the hurt that hurt people. I know that's a quick, easy kind of answer, but there is accountability there, but there needs to be a recognition of what actually was happening in the context of it. But I do agree that it is clunky and raggedy and challenging to talk about. Yeah.
And I think that's where we have to start, is to say, how can we think about this and move with this in a way that lets us move and that in no way dishonors the wound that was delivered to Black people on the continent.
Yeah. And we won't do this perfectly either, right? It's like, and that's okay. Yeah.
33% with rupture and repair is that piece is about that we hit each other empathically just right about 33% of the time, and all the rest of the time there's some kind of rupture, and then we can come back and repair with each other if we feel enough safety to share about that rupture. Mm-hmm. So that, again, what you said at the very beginning, Vanessa, cultivation slowly, bit by bit, little bit at a time, of trust. Mm-hmm. safety, and then I always want to add to that humility, because if we on the right side of things don't come with humility, we're going nowhere, I don't think.
Yeah.
So another very foundational kind of question, how do we deal with our tortured history as we embody them?
Together. I think that all trauma heals best in the accompaniment of another person. So or people.
Yeah.
Again, safety and in deep listening, just those, those important words that you said at the beginning, Vanessa. And I know, as a trauma therapist, how do we deal with trauma? We begin to feel in our bodies what happens when we begin to think about these things and know about these things. And in particular, I've gotten much more interested in the kind of history 4 generations back that my people were carrying. So we begin with some knowledge, but then we get to feel into our knowledge. Like perhaps on my side of things, maybe there was a lot of perpetration that was happening. I don't know for sure about that, but I'm curious. And how can I sit with that and go underneath the perpetration to the trauma that caused the person to be a perpetrator? And I begin to feel it in my body as I into this. And then I share it. I'm very lucky to have Joe, with whom I can share anything and feel trust, or I can share it with you.
Yeah.
And then just in being deeply heard like that, things begin to shift inside.
Mm-hmm. And for me, it's that whole concept of both and, right? It's both, what do I do with my history, right? How do I heal and do the slow, embodied relational work it requires to grieve and to heal? And then both that, and how do I take action in the now to make sure that I am both, I am the ancestor, right, of my descendants. And so I need to take action in the now so that I'm changing what my great-grandchildren and grandchildren will inherit from me. So it's that both and that I think helps me to be in a space of grace with this whole challenging, awful moment, right? It's that the grief has risen, and healing is here at my plate as a healer. What do I do with this? The grief is risen. And how do I make sure that I'm taking action now that allows the next generation to have lessened grief, lessened things to deal with? And so I think that approach has really had meaning for me, and I offer it to those who are listening, to just thinking about how do you take care of yourself and your people, and how do you take care of your descendants?
Yes.
What inheritance are you leaving for them? And what actions do you need to take today to make sure that you're being a good ancestor? Right?
Yeah. I'm really timid by nature, so doing this today is a little strange for me. I'm realizing that there are ways that my system has adapted through. I'm more apt to, seems like, identify on the victim side and the withdrawal side of things, partly because of my family history, but I think also maybe there's some epigenetics in there as well, of being, pulled back. So the moving out toward an area that is potentially high conflict, not with you, but I mean, just
I know what you're saying.
Area is something that is maybe a tiny little offering, but is in the direction of healing tendency.
Yeah. And just knowing that however we take those actions, they're right? It's the right thing to do. This, that slow, we want to rush to everything, but it's that slow, intentional, deliberate offering that we can make toward healing this and moving this forward, right? We can't stay where we are. The time is now. We can't stay in this place, and there is a sense of urgency, but we have, in order to really have meaningful action, we have to be slow and intentional. So that tension between the sense of urgency and knowing we have to move slow and deliberately and intentionally is very hard. you know, it's challenging.
It is. Pacing is so important with this.
Yeah.
And something that I thought about, I guess just yesterday maybe too, was like, I was hearing people after George Floyd's murder, there was such a huge outcry around the world. And then I'm sure things were happening, but nothing of that magnitude. And then you could begin to feel everything kind of going back down underground. And I started to hear people express concern that the energy of this movement was going to abate again, and it was going to just be another blip. And then Jacob Blake is shot 7 times in the back. And it's like, I do not want the thing that keeps us going to be another injured Black person, Indigenous person. Somehow we have to find the courage.
Trans person.
Trans person, yeah, whatever, disabled person, whatever it is, whoever we push to the outside, that I think each of us in white bodies need to take responsibility for staying engaged and staying engaged in our inner process and outer process in whatever ways make sense for us, but that we each have an absolute obligation to stay engaged in the long change.
Yeah.
So I wanted, I mean, again, I'm not getting to all the questions, but one other was a comment on the writer was saying, you know, I really appreciate the interpersonal neurobiology history and the reference to Porges and Dan Siegel and all of these European males. But they were wondering if there was a way to widen the conversation so that there was more explicit inclusion of the fact that many of the more indigenous cultures and cultures rooted in indigenous knew this a long time ago and didn't need to do scientific studies to prove it and had ways of talking about it.
Yeah. What I will say about that, because I thank whoever wrote that question, because it was such a question burning in my heart at every class I was ever in. So I so appreciate it. And I think that, I don't have an answer to that, but one of the things that I know is that we as people of color and indigenous people and Black people inherited ways of coping with trauma and stress that were story, relation, music and movement, breath, dreams. Like, these are our tools. They're why we haven't fallen down and given up. They sustained us for millennia, for generations. And so I know that Porges and, you know, the science of neurobiology, that they stand on the backs of our ancestors. They inherited these resiliencies, these methods. And I think that for me, it's that knowing and the need to say it in every single classroom I was ever in was my answer to the question that Joe just posed. I would, you know, it was just this, do you know that, you know, that you're inherited this from indigenous Black people, right? Including indigenous people from all over the world. This is old human knowledge. This is ancient human practice. So,
and somehow managed to survive in the most inhospitable possible conditions. You know, watching Native Americans dance, you just know it. You know that they know the wholeness of everything, and in spite of the desecration of their whole way of life, their bodies haven't forgotten. So
no, one of my favorite things to listen to my grandmother, whose mother was enslaved. So my grandmother's mom had been enslaved. And so my grandmother knew all of the songs that her mother would sing, because her mother would sing these songs to her. And so one of my favorite things was listening to my grandmother sing these songs. And there was a rhythm and a breath to these songs. And finally, as a young adult, I was watching the movie Roots, and I didn't even know that those were slave songs, and that they sang them to get through the work, the hard, backbreaking work that they were going through. Yeah, so it is, this, there isn't anything new under the sun in some ways, but there is a way that when we don't honor that past, it gets erased. And so I appreciate the question, because it's really saying don't erase the people of color who contributed to this field. And I agree that it happens. People of color are erased often in these conversations.
Not only erased, but one of the things we've been looking at in all of our study groups is, what does it mean that interpersonal neurobiology is literally a white man's construct out of good science. I mean, and I think it has value, and I think it has ways that help us understand connection and all of that, but we're being very curious. As a woman, I'm curious also, about what it means that this is a construct of very well-intentioned and everything white men, but it still has a lens on it, and particularly application of it that does not include the heart, and often does not include nearly as much of the experiential nature of this, which to me is where the crossover with indigenous communities can happen. The recognition that the crossover is there.
Right. And I think that it kind of may go back to, there's a paper that I use in some of my other trainings that's called The Habits of White Supremacy. And one of the things on that list of habits of white supremacy is whose method of science gets valued. Is it the oral traditions and the passing down from one generation to the next, how to survive? Or is it a 2-year study done by Kaiser? Right? It's like, whose science gets to be validated? I would say that the oral traditions of my ancestors are more meaningful to me than a 5-year study. But that's, those are the habits that we have as a culture, of some things get to be validated and other things are left to a different narrative of what they are.
It's nice to see them converging.
Yes.
I mean, there's more convergence now, which maybe is good.
So I'll start one more question, and then I'm going to disappear for a while. But it is, the question is, there's been some talk about how the trauma has affected white people coming over to this continent. And this participant's question is, how has it affected the bodies of Black people to contain the rage of centuries of injustice?
And that's where we're going next. So I think the next part will be a little bit of an answer for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah. Bye, Joe. So, we titled this Our Haunted History. And I know that our next webinar, we're going to talk quite a bit about personal history and how we, our personal resiliencies and practices, and really move to more of a conversation about what it is to hold the kind of trauma that we've had to hold as Black people, both collectively as a people and then individually for me as a person. But I just wanted to start my conversation about the history from a Black perspective with reading the definition of chattel slavery, which is the kind of slavery that we're talking about. So I just want you to just listen to the words and feel in your body what we collectively have inherited, because this is why we're here. It's what we're talking about. And so we're gonna just enter this together. So, a chattel slave is an enslaved person who is owned forever, and whose children and children's children are automatically enslaved. Chattel slaves are individuals treated as complete property to be bought and sold. Chattel slavery was supported and made legal by European governments and monarchs. And so I read that so that, because it tells us why we are in pain, right? It tells us why we're marching in the streets, why we're crying, why we can't sleep at night, why we are afraid, right? We could talk all day about all the things that happened, but this is the story that we're living. We're living a story and an inheritance of a system that dehumanized and made property out of other human beings. And so our journey won't be easy, because the story that we are waking from is horrific, right? It's a horrific story. One of my elders who's passed away now, her name is Lucille Clifton, and she's a great poet and writer. So if you haven't read her work, please Google it and read it. She's amazing. But after my father died about 10 or so years ago, I went to be with Lucille, and she came to the Arlene Switzer Hall in Portland, Oregon. And I was sitting on her, literally kind of cuddled up, because I was so grief-stricken about, I lost my dad maybe a week before. And I said to her, it's so hard. And I said something about being descendants of slaves. That there was something in my, I said descendants of slaves. And Lucille says, baby girl, don't ever say that again. And she says, you are the descendants of the enslaved. You are never, your people were never slaves. And so that is why when I read this piece about chattel slavery and what it means, it sought to turn humans into slaves. It was a system that sought to do that. And so I start our history there, where it began in that way. So Bonnie, I just want to ask you, as I ask you to listen to it, what are you noticing right now as you hear that?
Big pain in my heart. Like just a deep, it just gets really quiet and grief-stricken and sad. But my legs relax, and so does my belly, because I think I'm in the presence of truth.
Right. There is a way that we are liberated by the truth, and knowing the story that we carry is an important part of navigating the world in a way that has integrity and purpose and meaning, right? That's how we get to do it, is by knowing the story that we're carrying and living. So the other thing I wanted to say, it's impossible for me to even imagine what my ancestors who were brought over from Africa went through, or what my ancestors who brought them over from Africa, my grandfather is Dutch, went through, right, to carry their stories in me. And I went to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis about a year ago. And it's an amazing museum if you ever get there. But along one of the walls, they have a slave ship sculpture. And the sculpture where the part where the enslaved individuals are living is only about 3.5 feet tall. And they have sculptures of women and children and men, and they're folded so that they can't even hold their heads up. They're folded down in like a little C, and their hands are chained and their feet are chained, and they are stripped, even the women, of their clothing. There's nowhere to go to the bathroom. There's no one to bring them comfort. The language that they hear is not their language, and the cries and the moans that they heard of people dying giving birth, screaming. Those were the sounds that they were experiencing in that ship. And that journey, the middle passage, as we call it, as it's called, took a long time. And so they were in those conditions for a really long time. And it's said that over 30% of the enslaved folks who started the journey perished and were simply thrown overboard as, resources that were lost. And so those who made it to the Americas were then sold and given new names, and were also given no hope to find their way out of it, because their skin was the mark of their enslavement. And so to run would mean certain death or brutality. And you wore on your face and skin that the story that you were less than, and that you couldn't earn your way out of it. You were not indentured, right? You weren't going to earn your way out of this. You weren't going to buy your way to freedom easily. Not that those circumstances didn't happen for a few, but they were certainly not the norm for the most of the enslaved folks who came to the Americas. So that's part of the history of chattel slavery, is the inheritance of that moment from humanity and freedom and life to property and enslavement and a lack of humanity. And that journey, while long, was massive, because it's a journey, it's a fall from who and what you really know you are. The enslaved individuals knew they were not chattel. They knew they were not property. When Bonnie and I were talking about this earlier, I said they were being treated like animals. She goes, no, animals are free, right? So not even being treated as animals. So I don't know that we know how to hold that. That is the haunted history. That's part of the haunted history that we tell and carry. And while we know it on one level, I think sometimes when some people see Black skin, they still see someone less than human, less than worthy, or even dangerous, or even scary, right? Because of all that my skin brings to them. So, Bonnie, is there anything else you want to say? Well, I'm sorry, I'm doing haunted history here.
No, I'm just taking it in. Yeah.
So the other part I want to talk about in terms of our history is the consequences of resistance, right? So we hear about Harriet Tubman, and we hear about Ida B. Wells, and we hear about, who am I missing? I know they'll get on me later. But we come from an ancient, deep rebellion and resistance, right? But we don't often talk about the consequences of that, and the epigenetic memory of what it means to speak out on behalf of your children, to try to save and protect your family, to try to have and maintain land. Every step that we have taken has met violence. It is met with violence. So we have always resisted the idea that we as a people were less than human. We know better. We've always resisted that our children belong to somebody else, that they were not of our bodies as women, that our bodies didn't belong to us, that we had no control over breeding, or birthing. And, I use the word breeding because our becoming mothers was turned into breeding of chattel for somebody else's work. And so we have always resisted that. And I think part of the haunted history is resistance was met not just with violence, but with death and threat of death for the things that you valued and loved the most, your children and your family and your community. And right now, our community is resisting violence, right? The violence against Black bodies, state violence, community violence. I'm not even going to go into all of the N-words I've heard in the last 3 months, just going for a walk or going to the grocery store or coming home from a funeral. Each act of rebellion or resistance is met with violence. And that's part of the history that I think really is an important piece for us to hear and understand. Because with Bonnie, when you were talking about what the history of white people and what they had gone through, all of those things that they were going through were probably acts of violence against their journey toward liberation or freedom. And so there is a way that when the small try to express who and what they really know they are, their full humanity, the system of oppression and violence fights back, and we're seeing that. And it was always that way. And I think that sometimes people think that the Civil War was the first act of liberation, and Black people were fighting for their own liberation for the full time that they were enslaved. And it looked different in different ways, but that was one part of it that I wanted to mention. And let's see if I made everything that I wanted to talk about. What's our time like, Bonnie? Should I go into some of the stuff around Portland?
Oh, we have quite a bit of time.
Yeah. So a couple of things that I thought would be interesting as we talked about haunted history is to think about, I don't know, I know we're calling from all over, but Portland, Oregon has been on the tip of folks' tongue, and we're seen as this city of rebellion. And I just wanted to give a little context about how Oregon's haunted history. I was born in Portland, Oregon. And so this is an inheritance for me as well. But in 1844, in the state of Oregon, exclusionary laws were passed to prevent African Americans from residing in the state, literally from living in the state of Oregon. And Oregon was the only state in the entire union that became part of the union with those laws already on the books. They had already determined themselves to be a white-only state. Oregon has a strong, people think of the Ku Klux Klan as a Southern issue, but Oregon had, in 1921 to 1924, there were over 200,000 members of the Ku Klux Klan in the state of Oregon, and many of them were law enforcement officers, city leaders, and politicians. That's just in 1921. And I think the last thing I will mention here is that in 1896, the US Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal did not conflict with the 14th Amendment. And Oregon had laws in their civil rights that it was part of Oregon's constitution to limit the rights of Black people in the state of Oregon. So that's just a few of the things that I wanted to mention, kind of our history.
Mm.
I know, I'm feeling it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So would you like questions at this point, Vanessa, or where do you want to go from here? I mean, I really don't.
Yeah, let me check in with my body about that. Like, I think what's important and why we wanted to start with history and why we wanted to break it up into two histories when we know this is one history, right? We actually really embody that and know that as women, as friends. But I really thought it was important for us to talk about how the history was being experienced in different ways by the different ethnicities that we carry. Well, race is a construct. Both whiteness isn't an ethnicity and blackness isn't either. We both inherited these histories that define us by our skin, by the color, that colorism, right? Good and bad based on our skin color. And so while these are just like facts, this is all head stuff, our bodies have memory of all of this. And it's painful and difficult to carry. And we don't talk about the history enough because it's just too hard. We want to move on from it. In a lot of my anti-racism classes that I've taught, I always get a question about, well, I didn't do that, so why should I care about it, right? Why can't people get over it? Why can't they just stop talking about it? Nobody wants to talk about it anymore. And I get that. I get the desire to deny and minimize. I'm a person and we all want to do that when things are hard. We want to deny the impact and we want to minimize the pain. And I think that sometimes just reading these things and being with the words of them gives us space to not have to do that all the time. So I think that's what I wanted to end with.
It's a lot to say.
Yeah, it is.
Can I ask you a question, Vanessa?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think I've ever asked you this before when we were talking about this. And if you don't want to, if it doesn't feel like something.
Totally. I know.
How is it for you when I talk about the trauma history that white people were carrying when they came here? What happens for you when you talk about that?
Two things, and that's why I appreciated the question we got earlier about that. One is there is this automatic kind of, okay, I'm supposed to feel bad about this, right? But I'm also over it, right? Like, there's this part of you that just doesn't want to have to go there. But then there's the part of me that says, that really, really deeply wants to go there with my friend, right? Who really wants to be with my friend, who carries this inheritance of pain in a different way than I carry my inheritance of pain, but we meet each other there and we struggle together in that. And so there's both those things are really legitimately real for me. That kind of knee-jerk head thing of, who wants to hear that? And then there's also that, oh my gosh, this is real. And I think that happens when people hear my story too. I think there's a part of them that just wants us to get over it. And then there's a part of them that says, I want to meet you there so we can have this journey together and really grieve and heal together. I think it's the same reaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that push away is one of the ways we protect ourselves. Just push it away, start here and move forward and,
forget it all, right? Get over it.
Get over it, whatever it is a natural protective response, but man, it doesn't let us go anywhere.
No.
I really appreciate and want to hold both of those parts of you. If I were able, which I'm not, to be in your shoes, I can imagine it would be hard for me to hear or not think an excuse was being made, or something like that about it all. And in doing trauma work with individuals, people that know how I work, we do our best to try to trace back the transmitted trauma that the person who hurt me was injured as a child, and that's why the wound is there, and that's why I got put on me. And I think maybe I had to do that work for myself for years and decades and still work on it, that it feels important even when it feels so delicate.
I agree. I just don't think we get anywhere without doing it that way. It's why we wanted to do this. I think we both are very committed to an embodied process to do anti-racism work, really holding a different way to live this story and to make a new narrative and a new story. I think it matters that we make space for both the pain of white people and the pain of Black people, or the pain of humanity is how I really like to see it. The pain of humanity that we all carry. It's hard, but I think we're gonna need to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because tragedies keep happening if we can't get in touch with that pain that gives us that, because that process gives us back our humanity.
Yeah.
Or we can't see each other as human beings and, and feel that yearning to be together.
It also gives us a way to be together. I was just going to say, and it gives us the foundation for trust. It's why I fell in love with neurobiology work, right? It's relational neurobiology work, not like the other. Yeah, I know a little bit about that, but not as much. But just fell in love with it because it had that wholeness to it, right? It just allowed us as humans to have all the complexities that we carry. And we think about that as individuals, and then we expand it to communities, and then we expand it even bigger to the systems that we build as communities. We have to have a story that holds the complexity and makes welcome all the parts of each of us.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So that part of you is welcome here too, Bonnie, and appreciated.
Yeah.
So let me find our outline. I don't remember where we are.
You want to make some room for questions that may have come in while you were sharing?
Yes, I think we're right. That's where we are. Yeah, and then we were going to talk about passing it forward after that. Yeah. Poor Joe. So Joe is here. Good. Thank God.
It's like being muzzled until somebody says, okay, now you can speak. One question that came in from a couple of people was, if a person is childless, how do they participate in or have influence on subsequent generations?
I mean, I don't know what you would say, Bonnie, but my answer is through community. You are impacting all of the people around you all of the time. And so every child born in your community is born of you too. Whether it comes through your body or through someone else's body in your community, they are your children and they are born of you.
And we internalize each other so that any changes that each of us is making is touching every other person with whom we have any kind of emotionally rich relationship, emotionally powerful relationship, either on the hurtful side or on the not side. If I, as a white person, do the work and can be with people of color, with indigenous people, and see them in their full humanity, that recognition, human to human, that changes something. And if I'm received, that changes something in me that deepens that capacity. And if I'm that, so that then gets passed on to everybody around us. And so I do just what you're saying, Vanessa, we are all affecting each other all the time. So those changes happen more of an implicit transmission as you internalize me and carry me in your body that way. And those are very real. If my body's relaxed when I'm with you, Vanessa, it will feel different in your body than if my body is tense and on guard. You internalize.
And Vanessa, probably this is more for you, but someone of Indigenous or Black heritage wrote and spoke about having trouble empathizing with whites. And how to be with the rage or the trauma of that history?
Boy, that is such a real and legitimate, and as Black people, as people of color, we carry that, like, and especially now because we are under, make no mistake, unique and specific and targeted attack, right? So we're on the front lines and we didn't ask to be there. And I think that the first thing I would say is give you permission to be wherever you are with that, and to know that that is welcome and that that is legitimate and appreciated for what it is, which is that for me, when that rises in me and I just can't do it, and Bonnie knows this because we talk about so many things, but when I can't do it, I simply don't do it, right? I give myself permission to take a break, to take good care of myself, to not have to carry other people's rage or problems because it's just enough to carry my own. I let my activism or my ability to connect or engage be completely authentic. And when it's not there, I give myself permission to do what my body's calling for, which is to take tender care of itself. I don't judge myself for those moments. I can't imagine anyone who could be on the front line as long as we have for generations as people of color and Indigenous people, and to be under attack for as long as we have and not feel like we just don't want to carry your stories anymore. And I think that that's a really legitimate place to be. I don't think we have to stay there, but I also don't think we have to force ourselves out of that instinct if it doesn't feel appropriate. What would you say, Bonnie?
Yes.
And related to that, there was a question from a white participant saying that much of what she was listening to was bringing tears, and she felt some shame about having the tears because she felt that there was, I mean, these are my words, not hers, but a sense that white women's tears aren't welcome.
Mm. I'll take that.
You want me to take that?
Mm-hmm.
I think that if those tears are, what do I want to say? If those tears aren't a cry for somebody to make us feel better, like, could you comfort me now, please, in my tears? Because you see I'm grief-stricken about what's happened to you. And if there is any of that in there, then that's not going to be helpful for either party. Mm. But if we can't feel a depth of grief that brings tears, that it's very hard to heal without that. So I think tears of genuine grief that we're willing to sit with and own and feel and hold ourselves with support of whoever wants to feels comfortable supporting us are extremely important. I mean, our cells are literally cleansed of trauma when we're able to cry, and it's very hard for our cells to get that release if we don't have tears. But I think that something that I think, and you correct me about this, Vanessa, if I'm not saying this right, but there is such a history of Black people having to comfort white people so white people won't hurt them.
Yeah.
That it can feel those white tears can feel like they're making that request. And if they are, that's not appropriate. But if the tears come from this heartfelt, grief-stricken place of any of the things we've talked about today, then I think that they're essential on the path of healing, but something that we're willing to sit with and keep grieving. Not hurt now make me feel better. It's like, I need to grieve, and I need to grieve as long as I need to grieve. And it's always helpful to grieve with another.
Yeah. And what I would say, because I have cried with so many of my friends of multiple races, and I think there's nothing more human than empathy, right? To recognize the suffering of another human who's placed in the circumstances that we described in our haunted history stories. that's to me validation of the humanness of us as a species, that you can cry with me and I can cry with you, and that this construct of difference that has been built around us falls away for me in that moment. In that moment, we're just what we really truly are, humans holding one another, grieving together for a great injustice that has happened in our species. And there's nothing more authentic or natural or beautiful than that for me.
Anything else, Joe?
Well, there are a couple of logistical questions about one person asking for names. I think they wanted Resma's name and they wanted maybe Porge's name. So they wanted to know people that had been referred to as resources. And then also wondering a couple of questions about the recording. I think the recording, and I can't answer this, would have to go to Bettina or Tanner, but is the recording going to be available to everybody who's attended? I think that the answer to that is yes, but
Bettina.
It's going to be available to everybody anywhere at any time, right? On all three of our on Vanessa's and Natural Lifemanship and on Nurturing the Heart's website.
I'll answer that very quickly. So we have to get the recording and then it will be available to anybody. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then there was one more question that I'll refer to, and I apologize to anybody who feels like their concern hasn't been addressed, but this one was from someone who is of mixed race and was wondering if you had any comments about someone who is in that circumstance.
So is there more to the question, or?
I don't know if I can find the exact question again.
Okay.
But it was saying that they were of two races, and how do you navigate that?
Yeah. I think, I wish, I have biracial children. My daughters are biracial and my grandchildren are biracial but appear to be white. And I have learned through their struggle that there's a pull that happens for them, that they have to pick one side or another. And this is particularly a struggle that my children have shared with me, that there's a pull there and that they feel like that they're being asked to have some sort of pick a camp or be loyal or disloyal to some part that is part of who they actually are inside of themselves. And I think, while I can't personally speak to that journey because I'm dark-skinned Black woman, and while I have we're all so many ethnicities, I live my life as a Black woman. And so I don't have that tension. But I can speak to how hard that was for my daughters. And what I often told them was that it was important for them to understand the difference between their unique heritage as individuals and this construct of racism that they find themselves in. And that duality, the idea that they have to pick a side isn't part of the ancestors that live in their bodies and the people who make up who they are. That's an external construct that doesn't have to be part of their community. And I don't know if that was helpful to them or not, because kids are not going to tell you good job, mom. But hopefully it was helpful. And so I just offer it as what I have to offer.
Okay.
Fine.
Thank you. Well, I, of course, have absolutely nothing to offer around that because I have not had the experience. My family. So I'm just glad to hear.
Yeah.
So, and there's one question I don't understand that's related to this. And the reason I don't understand is that I don't know these people that are being referred to. But the question reads, if race is a made-up construct, then why are we so upset at Rachel Dolezal and Jessica Krug?
I don't know that.
Great. Thank you, ancestors. So I got it. Those are, now, I think that these are white women who were professors. One was an NAACP professor and one our NAACP president in Tacoma, Washington, and the other is a white woman who just recently shared that she was pretending to be an African American or biracial individual. So these are white people who are putting on the culture of Blackness, but not just like by cultural appropriation. They're actually like saying they're Black and living their lives as if they're Black. Does that ring a bell to either of you, or is this totally off base?
I saw an article that I didn't read carefully about the woman who recently was uncovered that disclosure.
Yes. Bonnie, do you have thoughts on that? I mean, my thoughts are probably not really, I'll just, being embodied, I think for me personally, where I struggle with that is that if you're putting on the cloak of Blackness and you can take off that cloak of Blackness, then that is as dehumanizing to me as saying I'm 3/4 of a human being. Like it makes my culture into a prop that can be entered into and walked away from. And that's painful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would wonder what the need was, what the meaning is for each of those women about doing that. But it really strikes something in me, when you say you can take it on and off, you don't get to do that.
No, and so you're getting the benefits of my culture without the struggle. Yeah, it just feels kind of caricaturizing, right? It reduces me to something less than human when someone does that. There's a way that it just feels really kind of like blackface in a way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I don't fully understand it either. I don't understand the motivation for that. Yeah, that's a great question. It's a very complicated dynamic. I don't think I fully understand the motivations or why someone would do that.
Probably pretty individual to the person taking it on, but I don't know either. I think we're almost out of time, and you have a poem to read, I think.
Yes, I am ready to read that.
Thank you, Jill.
Come on, Nessa. Come on. Keep talking. I'm going to find it, Bonnie. I don't know why. Here it is. Okay. Okay. So, Bonnie, can you talk a little bit about who wrote this poem? Because I don't know. Marshall the way you do.
Marshall Lyles is a good friend who lives in Austin, and he also is a poet as well as a therapist and a very heartfelt, remarkable man, and he's given us permission to share this far and wide.
So, and is Marshall a man of color?
No, but he's a man of disability.
Ah, okay. So it's called A Privileged Tale. I'm tired of carrying these bags. Who can I get to haul this extra weight? You there, carry my bags. Ah, yes, this feels nice. I feel free now. And suddenly I realize I should have never had to toil so. You there, since you're already carrying my bags, carry my food. I'll still want to eat it all. Clearly, I'm more important because only one of us is walking free. Though I don't like how you are looking at that food, I don't trust you with it. But I also don't want to carry it. What a stressful problem. Do you see how hard my life is? Plus, why do I have this coat when I'm currently not cold? You there, since you have my bags and my food, take my coat. How frustrating for me that you move so slow. That's more proof that I'm superior. See how nimble I am? You should really be able to keep up. Now I'm suddenly aware that even items in my pockets make me feel less free. You there, take these things from me. Nothing should hinder me. I'm too essential to be held back in the slightest. But don't steal my things. Your role is to hold my baggage, but don't think you have the right to use it. And stop asking for help. Do you think you are owed free handouts? After all this time struggling to keep up, what have you done to deserve help? Work harder like me. I'm getting so much done, all on my own. But I might one day need to know how to carry heavy weight. I haven't had the practice. I feel insecure, even thinking about it. Surely I can find a teacher. You there.
Good to be here with you, my friend.
Yeah. Thank you, Bonnie, for joining me in this little journey that we decided in one moment to do. And here we are.
Thank all of you who've been here and with us today too. And I will see you in a couple of weeks.
Have a good rest of your time. And thank you so much for joining us and hearing our stories and carrying this narrative with us and learning together. I hope that we will see you in our next webinar. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you.